Welcome back. Grab your patch of grass, lay out your blanket, or unfold your chair. Get comfy, and let's go. Fair warning right up front, this one's going to be a bit of a roller coaster. So buckle up. We're going to talk about something that happened recently that has everyone's panties in a twist. And I'm going to start by saying something that's probably going to make half of you want to turn this off immediately. But stick with me, because we're going to go on a little journey together. And I promise you, we're going to end up somewhere you probably didn't expect. So here's the thing that's going to make you mad at me right out of the gate. There's precedent for what just happened to Jimmy Kimmel. That's right, you heard me. There's historical precedent for government officials pressuring media companies to silence voices they don't like. And before you start screaming at your phone or your car stereo about fascism and authoritarianism, and trust me, we'll get there, let me just say that precedent doesn't equal justification, but it does equal context. And context is something we seem to have completely abandoned in this country. Now I know exactly what you're thinking right now. Dave, are you seriously going to defend this? And the answer is no. I'm not going to defend it. But I'm also not going to pretend like this is some unprecedented assault on democracy that just fell out of the sky. Because that would be intellectually dishonest. And if there's one thing I can't stand, it's intellectual dishonesty. So let's start with the fact we are not going to focus on the specifics of what Jimmy Kimmel said, because that is not important. The response to the comments is. Jimmy Kimmel made some comments about the Charlie Kirk assassination. And let me just pause here for a second, because Jesus Christ, we're living in a timeline where I have to say the Charlie Kirk assassination like it's just another Tuesday. But anyway, Kimmel made some comments that apparently rubbed some people the wrong way. The FCC chair, that's Brendan Carr, if you don't know, basically threatened ABC's broadcast license. Sinclair Broadcasting, which operates ABC stations in 30 markets, said they'd stop airing the show, and boom, indefinite suspension. Now here's where it gets interesting, and here's why I'm going to say something. And here's where I'm going to say something that's going to make the other half of you mad. This isn't new. This exact playbook has been run before. Multiple times by multiple administrations from multiple parties. Let's take a little trip down memory lane, shall we? Because apparently we all have collective amnesia when it comes to inconvenient facts. Vladimir Putin started with independent media outlets in Russia, closed them down one by one. Journalists who criticized him, they ended up in prison, or worse. After the 2016 coup attempt in Turkey, Recep Erdogan shut down media outlets, imprisoned thousands of journalists, all in the name of protecting democracy. In Hungary, Viktor Orban didn't use violence. He used economics, made it impossible for independent media to operate, forced them to sell to his allies or shut down. Very clean, very legal, very effective. In China, journalists who report unfavorable coverage, they disappear. Sometimes literally, sometimes just professionally. Either way, the message is clearly delivered. Now, I can hear some of you say, but Dave, those are authoritarian countries. That's different. That could never happen here. You're absolutely correct. Or are you? Let's look at our own history. Richard Nixon. Anyone remember him? This guy had what he called an enemies list. And guess who was on that list? Journalists, media personalities, anyone who said mean things about Tricky Dick. He used federal agencies, the IRS, the FBI, to investigate and harass critics. He pressured networks. He threatened broadcast licenses. Sounding familiar? But wait, there's more. Lyndon Johnson. And for those of you keeping score at home, Johnson is a Democrat, Nixon was a Republican. Johnson used to call network executives directly, not their assistants, not their PR people, the executives themselves, at home on weekends to complain about coverage and threaten regulatory action. But Dave, you're saying those were different times. Were they? Were they really? Because let's fast forward a little bit. In his first term, Donald Trump, and before you start cheering or booing, just listen, spent 4 years calling for boycotts of the media outlets, suggesting the government should revoke broadcast licenses, and pressuring advertisers to drop shows that were critical of him. Remember when he went after SNL? Remember the constant attacks on fake news? And here's the kicker. It works sometimes. Advertisers did pull out. Shows did get canceled. People did get fired. Now, I can hear some of you saying, Dave, that was different because Trump is a fascist. And I can hear the other half of you saying, Dave, that was different because the media really was biased against Trump. You know what? You're both missing the point. The point is that using the power of government to pressure private companies to silence critics isn't a Republican thing or a Democrat thing. It's a power thing. It's what people in power do when they don't like what other people are saying about them. Let's go back a little further. Let's go back to the 1950s. Joseph McCarthy. Remember him? He used his Senate platform to pressure networks and sponsors to blacklist entertainers and journalists he deemed communist sympathizers. He ruined careers. He destroyed lives. All in the name of protecting America from the Red Menace. How about the Fairness Doctrine? It was in effect from 1949 to 1987. It literally required broadcasters to present controversial issues in a balanced way. That sounds reasonable, right? Except who decides what's balanced? The government, the FCC, the people in power. And you know what's really rich? Both parties loved the Fairness Doctrine when it benefited them and hated it when it didn't. It was finally repealed under Reagan. And guess what happened next? Talk radio exploded. Cable news became a juggernaut. The internet happened. And now we're more divided than ever. And both sides are nostalgic for the good old days when the government decided what was fair and balanced. Are you seeing the pattern here? We started with the foreign examples. Putin, Erdogan, China. We shake our heads and say, thank God we don't live in countries like that. But then we look at our own history and realize that the playbook is exactly the same. The only difference is the degree and the efficiency. So I overheard a conversation last week. Two guys were talking. One of them was a retired teacher. Seemed like a reasonable guy. He said something that stuck with me. He said, I don't like Jimmy Kimmel. I think he's a liberal hack who's not funny anymore. But this whole thing makes me uncomfortable. His friend asked him why. He said, because what happens when it's someone I do like? That, friends, is called thinking ahead. That's called understanding consequences. That's called not being a human echo chamber. Because here's the thing, and this is where we get to the meat of this whole episode. When you cheer for the silencing of voices you don't like, you're setting a precedent. You're saying it's okay for the government to pressure private companies to get rid of people who say things that upset the people in power. And power changes hands. Let me ask you a question, and I want you to really think about this. Don't give me your knee-jerk reaction. Don't give me your tribal response. Give me your honest, thoughtful answer. If this exact same scenario had played out under a different administration, let's say Obama or Biden, but instead of Jimmy Kimmel, it was Tucker Carlson or Ben Shapiro or Joe Rogan, how would you feel? If the FCC under a Democratic administration had threatened Fox News' broadcast license for something Tucker said and Fox had immediately suspended his show indefinitely, would you be cheering? Or would you be screaming about authoritarianism? Your answer to that question tells you everything you need to know about whether you're thinking independently or just following your tribe. Let me read you something. This is from a quote I found while researching for this episode. It's from a journalist writing about media censorship, and I'm not going to tell you who wrote it or when until after I read it to you. Quote, "The danger to America is not from any external enemy, but from the gradual erosion of our democratic institutions by those who would use the power of government to silence their critics. When we allow fear and partisan loyalty to override our commitment to free expression, we are no longer the country our founders envisioned." End quote. Now, before you start nodding along or getting angry, let me tell you when that was written. 1973. During Watergate, about Nixon. But it could have been written yesterday. It could have been written about any administration in the last 50 years. Because this isn't new. This cycle isn't new. The only thing that's new is our collective amnesia about it. Here's what really gets me about the whole situation. And this is where I'm going to get a little ranty, so bear with me. We've completely abandoned any sense of consistency or principle when it comes to free speech. It's all tribal now. It's all about whose ox is being gored. When your guy is in power and he goes after media personalities you don't like, it's accountability and consequences for dangerous rhetoric. When the other guy is in power and he goes after the media personalities you do like, it's fascism and an assault on democracy. But here's the thing. It's the same behavior. It's the same precedent. It's the same erosion of norms and institutions. And every time we excuse it because it's our guy doing it, or because we don't like the person it's happening to, we make it a little bit easier for the next guy to go a little bit further. You know what the scariest part of this whole Jimmy Kimmel thing is? It's not that it happened. It's how quickly it happened. It's how efficiently the machine worked. The FCC makes a threat. Corporate partners apply pressure. Network folds immediately. Show gone. All in the span of what? 48 hours? That's not bureaucratic inefficiency. That's not the wheels of government grinding slowly. That's a well-oiled machine. That's a system that knows exactly how to work. And that should scare you, regardless of what you think about Jimmy Kimmel or Charlie Kirk or any of the players in this particular drama. So a friend of mine was telling me about a conversation he had with his daughter. She's in college, smart kid, probably smarter than both of us. She asked him what he thought about the whole situation, and he told her, very similar to what I'm telling you, that there's precedent for this kind of behavior. And she said something that really stuck out. She said, "Dad, just because there's precedent doesn't mean it's right." Out of the mouths of babes, right? She's absolutely correct. There's precedent for a lot of terrible things. There's precedent for Japanese internment camps. There's precedent for McCarthyism. There's precedent for warrantless surveillance. There's precedent for a lot of things that we now look back on and say, how did we let that happen? But here's the thing. We let them happen because at the time, they seemed reasonable. And at the time, they seemed necessary. At the time, they seemed justified by circumstances. And we had precedent. So let's talk about precedent for a minute. Because I think we need to examine what precedent actually means and what it should mean to us as citizens. Precedent in the legal sense means that past decisions influence present decisions. It's the foundation of our legal system. But precedent isn't supposed to be a justification for bad behavior. It's supposed to be a guide for consistent application of principles. The problem is we've started using precedent as an excuse. Well, Nixon did it. Well, Obama did it. Well, Trump did it. Therefore, it must be okay for our guy to do it. But that's not how precedent is supposed to work. Good precedent should make us better. Bad precedent should make us more vigilant. When we look at Nixon's enemies list, we're not supposed to say, well, that gives us permission to have an enemies list too. We're supposed to say, that was wrong, and we should never do it again. When we look at McCarthy's blacklists, we're not supposed to say, well, that worked pretty well, let's try it again. We're supposed to say, that was a dark chapter in American history, and we should learn from it. But that's not what we're doing. We're using bad precedent to justify more bad behavior. And every time we do that, we move a little bit further away from the country we claim to want to be. Here's a thought experiment for you. I want you to imagine that you're designing a country from scratch. You get to write the rules. You get to decide how power works, how institutions work, how the relationship between government and media works. Would you design a system where the government could pressure private companies to fire people who said things the people in power didn't like? Would you design a system where regulatory agencies could threaten businesses with financial ruin if they didn't comply with unspoken political demands? Would you design a system where corporate consolidation meant that a few phone calls could silence voices across dozens of markets? Of course not. Nobody would design that system. Nobody would look at that arrangement and say, yes, this is how freedom should work. But that's the system we have. That's the system we've built precedent by precedent, compromise by compromise, tribal victory by tribal victory. Let me share some numbers with you because I'm a data guy and I think numbers help put things in perspective. In 1983, 50 companies controlled 90% of American media. Today, that number is 6. 6 companies control 90% of what Americans see, hear, and read. In the television industry, specifically 4 companies, Disney, Comcast, Viacom, and Fox, control about 85% of the market. In radio, iHeartMedia and Cumulus Media control about 70% of the market. Now, what does that mean for something like the Jimmy Kimmel situation? It means that when the government wants to silence someone, they don't have to make 50 phone calls. They don't even have to make 20 phone calls. They can make 6 phone calls and reach 90% of the market. That's not a free press. That's not a diverse media landscape. That's an oligopoly with a direct line to government pressure. And the scariest part? Both parties helped create this system. Both parties approved the mergers. Both parties loosened the regulations. Both parties benefited from having fewer, more manageable media outlets to deal with. You know what I keep thinking about? I had seen someone post about a conversation with their dad. How before he passed away, they had had this conversation about politics, which they usually tried to avoid because they didn't agree on much. And he said something that really stuck with his child. He said, I've been voting for 60 years, and I've seen a lot of presidents come and go. The thing that worries me isn't any particular politician. It's that we keep giving them more and more power, and then we act surprised when they use it in ways we don't like. That's the Jimmy Kimmel situation in a nutshell. We've spent decades building a system where government officials can pressure media companies, where corporate consolidation makes that pressure more effective, and where partisan tribalism makes half the country cheer when it happens to people they don't like, and then we act surprised when someone uses that system. Let me tell you what really bothers me about the response to this whole situation. It's not the people who are defending it. At least they're being honest about their priorities. It's the people who are acting like this is unprecedented. This is fascism, they scream. This is authoritarianism, they cry. This has never happened before. But it has happened before. Many times. Under multiple administrations. From both parties. And if you were paying attention, you would know that. The only reason it seems unprecedented is because either you weren't paying attention before, or you didn't care when it happened to the people you disagreed with. Remember when the Obama administration used the IRS to target conservative groups? Remember when they secretly monitored AP reporters? Remember when they prosecuted more whistleblowers under the Espionage Act than all previous administrations combined? Remember when Trump went after SNL, CNN, and MSNBC? Remember when he suggested that NBC should lose its broadcast license? Remember when he pressured the Pentagon to block AT&T's merger with Time Warner because he didn't like CNN? Remember when Bush used the Patriot Act to expand government surveillance powers? How about when Clinton used the Fairness Doctrine to go after talk radio? Remember when Reagan mostly left the media alone. It's probably why they don't hate him as much. Anyway, here's my point. This isn't new. The players change. The targets change. The justifications change. But the behavior doesn't change. The precedent just keeps building. And every time it happens, we get a little bit more used to it. We get a little more accepting of it. We get a little more tribal about it. Until eventually, we're not even pretending to have consistent principles anymore. We're just cheering when our team scores and booing when the other team scores, regardless of what game we're actually playing. I want to read something else to you. This is from Daniel Ellsberg. He wrote it in 1971 when he was facing charges for leaking the Pentagon Papers. Quote, "The only way to avoid becoming a totalitarian state is to maintain the courage to criticize those in power, regardless of party, regardless of popularity, regardless of consequences. The moment we start making exceptions for national security, for public safety, for political necessity, we start down a path that leads to a place we don't want to go." Now, Ellsberg was no conservative. He was probably the opposite of whatever you consider a conservative to be. But he understood something we seem to have forgotten. Principles aren't principles if you only apply them when it's convenient. Free speech isn't free speech if you only defend it for people you like. Government overreach isn't government overreach only when the other party does it. Abuse of power isn't abuse of power only when it targets your allies. That brings me to the question I really want to ask you. The question that's been bothering me since this whole Kimmel thing started. What kind of leader do you want? Do you want a leader who uses every tool at their disposal to silence critics, as long as they're your critics? Do you want a leader who pressures private companies to fire people who say things they don't like, as long as you don't like those people either? Do you want a leader who threatens business licenses and regulatory retaliation to get their way, as long as they're getting their way in directions you approve of? Because if you do, then you're not looking for a democratic leader. You're looking for an authoritarian who happens to agree with you. And here's the thing about authoritarians. They don't stay agreeable forever. They don't stay on your side forever. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And eventually they come for people you do like. Eventually, they come for you. I heard someone at the grocery store talking about this whole situation. They were asking what their friend thought about the historical impact. And the friend, apparently a history professor, said something I haven't been able to get out of my head. He said the problem with precedent is that it cuts both ways. You can use it to justify almost anything, but you can also use it to recognize patterns, and the pattern here is pretty clear. When government starts silencing media, even for what seems like good reasons, it never stops with just one voice. Think about that for a minute. It never stops with just one voice. Nixon didn't stop with one journalist. McCarthy didn't stop with one entertainer. Putin didn't stop with one newspaper. Erdogan didn't stop with one TV station. It starts with the people everyone agrees are problematic. It starts with the people who, quote, deserve it. It starts with the people who, quote, went too far. And then it expands. Because power, once exercised, wants to be exercised again. Because precedent, once set, wants to be followed. Because the machinery, once built, wants to be used. So here's where I'm going to get really uncomfortable and ask you some questions that you probably don't want to answer honestly. If you're in the camp that's cheering for what happened to Jimmy Kimmel, what happens when the next administration goes after someone you like? If you're defending the precedent now, how are you going to argue against it later? If you're saying this particular case is justified because Kimmel, quote, went too far, who gets to decide what too far means? And what happens when that decision-making power changes hands? These aren't rhetorical questions. These are real questions with real consequences, because the precedent you set today is the precedent that gets used against you tomorrow. I got a text message while I was preparing for this. It's from a friend of mine who works in media. I won't say where. I don't want them to get into any kind of trouble. They're good people. They've been in the business for a long time, about 20 years. And the text said, this Kimmel thing has everyone scared. It's not just the liberal hosts, everyone. Because if they can do it to him, they can do it to anybody. That's the real story here. It's not about Jimmy Kimmel. It's not about Charlie Kirk. It's not about any particular joke or comment or political position. It's about the chilling effect. It's about the message being sent. It's about the precedent being reinforced. The message is, if you say things we don't like, we have ways to make your life difficult. We have ways to hurt your career. We have ways to shut you up. And that message doesn't just go to late night comedians. It goes to journalists. It goes to podcasters. It goes to anyone with a platform and an opinion. Here's what I think is the most important question we need to ask ourselves. Is this the country we want to live in? Do we want to live in a country where government officials can destroy careers with a phone call? Do we want to live in a country where corporate consolidation makes censorship easier and more efficient? Do we want to live in a country where your ability to speak depends on whether you're saying things the people in power want to hear? Because that's the country we're building, precedent by precedent, exception by exception, tribal victory by tribal victory. And once we build it, once we normalize it, once we accept it as just the way things work, it becomes very hard to tear it down. I keep thinking about something that friend told me that his daughter said when they were talking about this. She asked him, "Dad, if all this is precedented, if this has all happened before, then why does it feel different now?" And I've been thinking about that question for days. Why does it feel different? I think it's because the machinery is more efficient now. The consolidation is more complete. The tribal divisions are deeper. The precedents are more established. But mostly, I think it's because we've stopped pretending to have principles. We've stopped even trying to be consistent. We've embraced the idea that power is its own justification. When Nixon went after the media, there were Republicans who stood up and said, "This is wrong." When Obama expanded surveillance powers, there were Democrats who said, "This is wrong." But where are those voices now? Where are the people in power saying, "You know what? This might be legal, it might be precedented, but it's wrong"? They're not there. Because we've trained them not to be there. We've taught them that consistency is weakness, that principles are liabilities, that the only thing that matters is winning. Let me ask you one more question. And this is the big one. This is the question that's going to determine what kind of country we become. Are you willing to defend free speech for people you disagree with? Not just in the abstract, not just in theory, but in practice. When it costs something, when it's inconvenient, when it means protecting people who say things you find offensive or wrong or dangerous. Because if you're not willing to do that, then you don't actually believe in free speech. You believe in speech you agree with. And that's not the same thing. The test of any principle is whether you'll stick to it when it's hard, when it's unpopular, when it protects people you don't like. And right now, we're failing that test badly. So here's where we are. We have historical precedent for government officials pressuring media companies to silence critics. We have a media landscape that's consolidated enough to make that pressure effective. We have partisan tribalism that makes half the country cheer when it happens to people they don't like. And we have a choice to make. We can continue down this path. We can keep building this machinery. We can keep setting these precedents. We can keep cheering when our team uses the power and booing when the other team uses it. Or we can step back and ask ourselves, is this really what we want? Is this really the kind of country we want to build? Is this really the legacy we want to leave our kids? Look, I'm not going to tell you what to think about Jimmy Kimmel or Charlie Kirk or any of the specific players in this particular drama. That's your decision to make. But I am going to ask you to think about the bigger picture. I'm going to ask you to think about precedent not as justification, but as warning. I'm going to ask you to think about what kind of country you want to live in and whether your actions and your support are helping to build that country or tear it down. Because here's the thing, and this is where I'm going to leave you. The country we get isn't going to be determined by what any particular politician or government official or media company does. It's going to be determined by what we, as citizens, are willing to accept. What we're willing to excuse. What we're willing to defend. And right now, we're accepting a lot of things that our parents and grandparents would have found unacceptable. We're excusing a lot of behaviors that we would have condemned just a few short years ago. We're defending a lot of actions that we know in our hearts are wrong. So the next time something like this happens, and there will be a next time, because there's always a next time, ask yourself, are you cheering because you think it's right, or because you think it benefits your side? Are you defending it because it's consistent with your principles, or because it hurts people you don't like? Are you accepting it because you think it makes the country better, or because you think it makes your team stronger? And if you're honest with yourself, really honest, I think you'll find that the answers to those questions tell you everything you need to know about what kind of citizen you're being and what kind of country we're becoming. In the spirit of transparency, this is the third time I've recorded this episode because the circumstances have changed the last 2 days. As of the recording of this, Jimmy is scheduled to go back on the air tonight. And there's all kinds of clatter about how that shows it was not the Trump administration that caused his removal. Additionally, there's a tremendous amount of social media chattering about the Biden administration pressuring Google to suppress dissenting voices on YouTube. All of which does nothing but amplify my points in this episode. So that's it, guys. I'll talk to you next time. Now get off my lawn.